Judge Sterling Rhodes looked down from his bench, a smug sneer twisting his lips as he spoke into the microphone. This chamber has certain standards. Some people just don't belong. His dismissive gaze saw only a woman in plain clothes, not the hardened resolve of a former federal agent. He had no idea Sloan Donovan wasn't there to argue a case. She was there to collect a debt. At the defendant's table, her brother Caleb sat shackled and hollowed out, his eyes locked on the floorboards as if they held the answers. When Sloan slid into the empty seat beside him, a bailiff shot up from his post. "Ma'am," the man barked, his hand hovering over his belt. "That chair's for counsel. Let's see your bar card. Now." Sloan didn't even look at him. She calmly opened a leather portfolio and slid a single folded document across the table. The bailiff grabbed it, his eyes scanning the page before he froze solid. The paper wasn't just a formality, it was a mandate. "Just wait here," he stammered before making a beeline for the judge's bench. Judge Rhodes made a show of shuffling his papers, pointedly ignoring the approaching officer. "We have a gallery for spectators," he announced to the room. "Not a stage for amateurs." The bailiff leaned in, handing him the document and whispering a few urgent words. Only then did the judge look up. His eyes found Sloan, sizing her up like an infestation to be exterminated. A dry, cruel laugh rattled in his chest. "Well, well," he said, leaning back in his throne of leather. "Decided to represent the defendant yourself, have we?" "That is correct, Your Honor." Sloan's voice was low and even. Rhodes shook his head, a mocking grin spreading across his face. He scanned the gallery. "Oh, I do enjoy these little pop-up lawyers. Always makes for good theater." Sloan's gaze was like granite. "Is there an issue with my filing?" The judge's smile evaporated. "Ms. Donovan," he said, lifting the paper by its corner as if it were contaminated, "are you fully aware that your brother is facing a decade in federal prison for a felony charge?" "I'm aware," she confirmed. "And you, an ordinary citizen, believe you can navigate these proceedings?" He scoffed. "This is a United States District Court, not a traffic dispute." A flash of panic crossed Caleb's face. Sloan's voice remained level, but it gained a sharp, metallic edge. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my understanding of the law is quite thorough." Judge Rhodes leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Knowing the rules of the game and playing it, Ms. Donovan, are two entirely different things." She met his stare without a hint of hesitation. "I've done both." The courtroom fell into a dead, electric silence. The judge, visibly thrown, slammed his folder shut. "Fine," he snapped. "Proceed. But don't think for a second we have time to waste on your little crusade." From the back of the room, a man in a simple gray suit, his face unreadable, made a deliberate note on a legal pad. Caleb leaned close, his voice a strained whisper. "Sloan, you can't do this." Her eyes remained fixed on the judge. "I have to," she breathed back. The prosecutor rose, carrying the smug confidence of a man who believed the fight was already won. He offered the court a cloud of baseless accusations, speaking of Caleb's questionable associates and history of poor decisions, but presented not a single shred of evidence. It was all smoke and insinuation. When he finished, Sloan stood. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence. "The prosecution has failed to provide the defense with the forensic analysis, the chain of custody for the alleged weapon, or the results of the fingerprint scan. We have nothing but conjecture." Judge Rhodes waved his hand impatiently. "A gun was in the vehicle, Miss Donovan. End of story." "The vehicle is not registered to my brother," Sloan stated plainly. "Furthermore, the preliminary arrest report states clearly that no identifiable prints were found on the weapon. Those are the undisputed facts." The judge's eyes narrowed. He was a man who did not tolerate being corrected in his own kingdom. "What I see," he hissed, "is an amateur stirring up trouble to hear herself talk." He leaned forward, his voice booming through the speakers. "You're fishing for an acquittal in the bargain bin, counselor." The insult hung in the air, a public declaration that Sloan and her brother were worthless trash, undeserving of the court's time. Caleb sank in his chair, the familiar shame of being rendered powerless by a man in a robe washing over him. But Sloan didn't shrink. "Objection," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "The bench will refrain from making personal and derogatory remarks about the defense." Rhodes smirked. A little courtroom color is permitted, Miss Donovan. Her eyes bored into him. So is a measure of respect. The room went absolutely still. The judge's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. He struck his gavel, but the sound was pathetic and weak, the hollow crack of a man who had just lost command of his ship. In the back row, the man in the gray suit wrote something else down. Sloane took her seat. "Are you okay?" Caleb whispered. "This is the easy part," she replied, her gaze never leaving the disgraced judge. That evening, a thick case file lay open on her desk, its cover stamped "Confidential." This wasn't about dredging up old pain. It was about sharpening an old weapon. It was a reminder of every arrogant man like Sterling Rhodes who smiled while he lied. It was a lesson, paid for in blood and betrayal, that you never let them get away with it. The file told the story of a young agent who once believed in the shield she carried. She wasn't just any agent. She was the youngest black woman at the Central Bureau to ever lead a federal corruption task force. Operation Veritas. Her target, a ring of dirty city officials and the judges who laundered their money. She remembered the day Operation Veritas died. It wasn't in a firefight. It was in a quiet, carpeted office. The agent she'd personally mentored, a kid she'd trusted with her life, sold her investigation notes to a corrupt prosecutor for a promotion. The official story was that her case was compromised and had been shut down. Weeks later, the crooked officials she'd been hunting were praised in the papers. Her reward was a dusty desk in a forgotten corner of the building, with no phone and no computer. They hadn't just fired her, they had buried her alive. Back then, she'd stayed silent, naively believing the system would correct itself. But she learned a brutal truth. Justice never arrives on its own. It has to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. Her cuff slid back, revealing the thin, silver line of a scar on her wrist. It was from a midnight raid that went sideways, a target she was warned not to pursue alone. Her backup team never showed, not because they were late, because they were never dispatched. When she found her after-action report deleted from the server, the final piece clicked into place. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message. Now she was back, not with a badge, but with a law book, defending the only family she had left. She stared at the wood-paneled wall and saw Judge Sterling Rhodes sneering from a bench he had stolen. This wasn't about an old grudge. This was unfinished business. No one in the room knew her real story, but now you do. The next morning, the state called its star witness, Milo Soto. A kid barely out of his teens shuffled to the stand, looking like a rabbit cornered by wolves. His sneakers squeaked in the dead silence, a nervous rhythm of fear. Sloane rose, her movements deliberate. She let the boy settle, her expression calm and unthreatening. "Milo," she began, her voice quiet, "you gave a statement to the police saying you saw my brother Caleb on the night in question. Is that correct?" The boy swallowed hard. "Yeah, that's what's in the report." "Tell me what you saw with your own eyes," Sloane said gently. Milo's gaze darted nervously to the prosecutor. "It was late. I saw a figure running from an alleyway. I couldn't really make out a face." "You couldn't see a face," Sloane repeated, not as a question, but as a fact. "So how did you identify my brother?" The boy's knee began to tremble. He glanced at the prosecutor, who was now studying the ceiling with intense interest. Sloane's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "Milo, let me be very clear. Did you see Caleb Donovan that night, or did a detective show you a photograph and tell you who you saw?" That was the key. The boy broke. He told me it had to be him," Milo confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame and relief. "He said they had their man, and that I'd be in serious trouble if I didn't confirm the story." A gasp swept through the gallery. Judge Rhodes slammed his gavel. "The witness is offering hearsay," he yelled, his voice cracking. Sloane turned, her eyes like chips of ice. "That isn't hearsay, Your Honor. That is a sworn confession to witness tampering." The judge's finger quivered as he pointed at her. "You are bordering on contempt, Ms. Donovan. And you are bordering on obstruction," she fired back, her voice ringing with authority. "If you try to silence a man who is telling the truth, this court is a place for justice, not a stage for your convenience." The room was utterly silent. The power had shifted, completely and irrevocably. On the stand, The terror drained from Milo Soto's face, replaced by a profound sense of release. But he wasn't done. He looked at Sloan, his voice thick with emotion. You won't remember me. You came to my high school a long time ago for a youth outreach program. A murmur went through the jury box. You told us that the truth has a louder voice than any lie. Milo continued, a watery smile on his face. It just needs a person brave enough to speak it for it to be heard. He took a shaky breath. I forgot that, but I remembered today. Suddenly, from the back of the courtroom, a single person began to applaud. A slow, defiant, rhythmic clap. The judge exploded. He shot to his feet, his face turning a shade of purple. Order! He screamed, hammering his gavel so hard the microphone squealed in protest. Order in this court! One more sound, and I will have the gallery cleared. The clapping stopped, but the damage was done. Sloan offered the young man on the stand a small, respectful smile. It was a silent promise. She returned to her table. You used to do those talks all the time, Caleb whispered, his own voice choked with emotion. Every Thursday, she confirmed. In the back row, the man in the gray suit leaned forward and gave a single, deliberate nod. Sloan felt its significance more than she saw it. As Sloan reached for her portfolio, her jacket sleeve snagged on the corner of the table, pulling it back. For a single stark moment, a jagged, silvery scar on her wrist was exposed under the harsh courtroom lights. It was more than just a scar. It was a story. That's a Kevlar burn, a bailiff whispered to his partner, his voice filled with awe. You don't get one of those sitting behind a desk. The whisper spread like wildfire. At the bench, Judge Sterling Rhodes went rigid, the color draining from his face. He stared at Sloan not as a lawyer, but as a ghost from a past he had personally helped to bury. No, he breathed, the words barely audible. It can't be her. But Sloan heard him. Caleb leaned in, his eyes wide with confusion. You told me you were done with all of that. Sloan took a slow, steadying breath, her gaze locked on the judge. I thought I was, she admitted. In that instant, the mask fell away. The man in the gray suit was no longer observing a trial. He was witnessing the return of a predator he had foolishly misjudged. The judge's hand shook so violently he could barely lift his water glass. The silence in the room was now thick with history and a chilling sense of dread. Panicked and cornered, Judge Rhodes made his final, fatal error. He spat into the microphone. You people always think you can bend the law to fit your rage. The room went ice cold. Before the racist slur could even settle, Sloan was on her feet. We don't bend the law, Your Honor, she said, her voice a quiet storm. We force it to look at its own reflection. This is not one of your lectures, Miss Donovan, he snarled. No, it's not, she agreed, her words sharp enough to draw blood. In a lecture, I would have to teach you the definition of justice. Here I am simply showing you the consequences of forgetting it. Her indictment hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Across the room, the man in the gray suit gave a subtle, almost invisible nod. The signal was sent. This court is adjourned, Rhodes barked, scrambling to escape. Justice doesn't run when the powerful get scared, Your Honor, Sloan stated, her voice echoing in the chamber. As if summoned, the main courtroom doors swung open. 3 federal agents in dark suits strode down the aisle with grim purpose. The lead agent held up a warrant. Judge Sterling Rhodes, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and multiple civil rights violations. This is my court, Rhodes croaked, his authority dissolving into pure terror. Not anymore, the agent said coldly. He nodded to a bailiff. Take off his robe. The bailiff complied, stripping the judge of his last symbol of power before the agent snapped the handcuffs shut. The sharp click of the steel was the only sound, a final, definitive end. The lead agent turned to the defense table. All charges against Caleb Donovan are dismissed with prejudice. The bailiffs unlocked Caleb's cuffs. He stood, pulling his sister into a fierce, desperate hug, breathing the air of a free man. As the disgraced judge was led away, the man in the gray suit approached Sloan. Your report on Operation Veritas was never buried, Agent Donovan, he said in a low voice meant only for her. It was just waiting for the right person to light the fuse. You did that. Sloan watched her brother, saw the tears of relief on Milo Soto's young face, and glanced at the empty, tarnished judge's bench. This was more than a win. It was a reckoning. She hadn't just saved her brother. She had forced a corrupt system to look in the mirror and, for the first time in a long time, recognize itself.